Hi, everybody. My name is Angie Byron, or WebChick. I go by on Drupal.org and other places, and I'm really thrilled to be here to introduce the panel that you see before you today, which is how we foster open source contribution. Hi. All right, so I want to talk about Drupal. Drupal is this amazing open source community with both individual and sponsor contributors. There's over 500 local user groups around the world, 2 million user accounts on Drupal.org, and 35,000 code contributors. It's a thriving, fantastic open source community, and we're really, really proud to be part of it. This talk is covering really important ground. So this is talking about how do we make Drupal sustainable in the long term? And really it gets into a larger question of making open source sustainable in the long term as well. Because sustainable contribution is key for increasing participation of marginalized groups. It's key for making sure that the software we know and love stays secure and working through the long run, and many other things like that. I work for Acquia. Acquia is proud to be a top contributor to Drupal and the Drupal Association. Our team that I work with, the Drupal Acceleration team, we contribute a bunch to core development, planning and executing major initiatives, marketing Drupal, sponsoring DrupalCon, all kinds of different things like that. We also care deeply about diversity and inclusion. So if you come to the booth, we're donating $5 to Black Girls Code for every person who registers, which is a great organization. And you can also try and beat Dries, Gabor, and myself in trivia tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday if you want, for prizes and fun. But it's important to note that even though, Acquia does all this stuff, we are definitely not the only company doing these things in the Drupal community. And also the full picture of all the types of contributions that go into making Drupal happen, that's just a small picture and expands way beyond just those. So I want to talk a little bit about this awesome panel, because this panel is filled with amazing folks who have a long-term record of contributing to Drupal and open source in various ways. And actually, if you take everyone's contribution experience in hand, it's almost a century's worth of experience being represented on this panel. So, and we even have a token man on the panel, so that's also really good. But yeah, there's a lot of women represented in this, and these women are amazing and doing great stuff. And Jeff is okay too. I'm just kidding, Jeff. So first I want to introduce Baddie. She's the CEO and co-founder of 1x Internet. She's also a Drupal Association board member and one of the main organizers of Drupal Europe, as well as helping to organize local events in Iceland and Germany. These events are really important because most of us who came into Drupal maybe first use it as a piece of software, but then later figured out, oh, there's these awesome people behind it. But the only way you really figure that out is if you go in person and you meet other people and you start to kind of hang out and get to know them. So sponsoring local events, a huge major thing that helps foster Drupal community and Drupal growth. 1x Internet also crunched the numbers in between their community work, sponsorship, membership of various boards, source code contribution. They contribute the equivalent of 7.5% of their budget to Drupal, which is huge. Jeff Walpole, he is the CEO and co-founder of Phase 2. He's also formerly a Drupal Association board member as well. He and his company have made just innumerous, uncountable contributions to Drupal over the years. They maintain a number of mission-critical contributed projects that Drupal needs, including the features module, the feeds module, things like that. They've also contributed financially to efforts to improve distribution tooling, ensuring critical bugs don't block the support of Drupal 8, these kinds of really major initiatives. And we've been really thrilled to have Phase 2's not only code contributions, but also governance contributions to the leadership of the Drupal project involved in that. Jeff is I serve with him on the Drupal Association board as well. He has a really great knack for just being really pragmatic about things and getting people to see, the forest for the trees. So I really appreciate Jeff's perspective. Denise, I don't even know where to start with Denise. Denise Cooper is a chairwoman at InnerSource Commons Foundation. She has also worked at more companies than I can even count, including PayPal, Intel, Sun Microsystems. And actually at Sun Microsystems, she founded the first open source programs office in the world at that point, I believe, and was key to open sourcing the Java language, including all the other different contributions that she's made to open source over the years. She also served as a Drupal Association board member, and I was always impressed by her ability to, whatever crisis we might have had at the Drupal board meeting, she was always like, oh yeah, you guys are fine. It's way worse over in this other place. She always kind of added a calm, steering to the ship in the process. So. And Deb Bryant is the board secretary and board director emeritus of the Open Source Initiative. The Open Source Initiative, if folks aren't familiar with that, that is the organization that kind of stewards the open source definition. So it makes sure that when companies say that they're open sourcing things, they're actually being factual about that, and they're not trying to like really open source. You know, we don't want air quotes open source. We want actual open source. Deb also has a tremendous resume, a mile long. But one thing I saw in there was that you used to work at the OSU Open Source Lab, which is an organization that hosts Drupal.org. So makes sure that all of our servers stay up and running and things like that. Deb's work is key because it helps contribute to the health of open source as a whole. So Drupal is an open source project. We depend on dozens of other open source projects, PHP, MySQL, you know, things like MariaDB. We benefit from Symfony, all these different things. And the work that Deb is doing is making sure that those projects are safe and protected and going into the future, and that other open source projects are being created as well. And sort of the acceptance of open source among enterprise and other types of things. It's kind of interesting that when the Open Source Institute was first founded, you know, Microsoft was like the biggest, you know, person against open source, and nowadays they own GitHub. So like that's how far we've come in our, you know, sort of belief in open source over the last 20 or so years. And then finally, Catherine Druckman is a friend of mine. Well, not that these other folks are friends of mine, but she's a co-host and producer of the Reality 2.0 podcast and the former director of digital experience at Linux Journal. So Catherine's work has been a lot around evangelizing Drupal and making sure everyone knows how awesome it is. She literally got us on the cover of a magazine about Drupal, which is amazing. And the other thing that I really love about Catherine is she's very good at understanding very complex technical things, but breaking them down to the point that a mere human can understand them. And I think that that is an invaluable skill set that helps make technology more accessible to everyone around. So, you know, if you look at these folks and all of the different kinds of ways that they contribute, I think it's clear that, you know, a project like Drupal doesn't happen if only one company is doing stuff. It needs a whole bunch of folks doing a bunch of different things. And that's why I'm really excited to hear what they've got to say about making open source more, you know, sustainable in the Drupal sense. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the folks talking about this topic. How can we foster open source contribution from companies to Drupal? Take it away.
Thank you. Wow, this was great. And Angie, like, you know, I know you're gone now, but thank you for everything that you've done. And like, I cannot forget like my first DrupalCon that I went to, and I saw Angie there, and I was like, you know, can I get close to her and maybe ask a question or something? And, you know, it's not many years ago, and this has just been great to be part of the community since then. So thank you all for joining this panel. We have, so I think Angie did most of the introduction, but I still want to do like maybe start off with some round. And what we need to think about is that there is a poll going on. So on Hopin, so we are on another platform here, so we have to maybe be switching around to open a platform, Hopin as well. So on Hopin, we have a poll asking if your company is already contributing to open source. And we already have around 28 votes. So everybody who's in here, please let us know if your company is contributing already. If not, then you can also just put in a no or I don't know. So feel free to answer that. Secondly, there's also a Q&A button there. So we would also love to hear the questions from all of you, and not just the questions that we ask here internally, but also ask us questions from everybody in the that is listening. But I think we are on a virtual conference now, and maybe we can just start with asking everybody, where are you? Like, I'm located in Frankfurt, Germany. So Denise, where are you?
Well, normally I would be in Ireland. And when I agreed to do this talk, I would have been in Ireland. But I'm in Austin, Texas, getting vaccinated.
Oh, that's great. And Deb, where are you located?
I am on the central coast of Florida.
And how is the weather there now? Like, I have to think about it, like in Europe, the weather is not that good.
Today's beautiful. It will be about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Yesterday, a thunderstorm went all day and took our power out. So today I have power. I'm grateful.
And Jeff, where are you?
I'm in Arlington, Virginia, so just across the river from DC.
Okay, and Catherine?
I am in Houston, Texas. Similar weather to Florida, warm and sunny. Yeah.
It's not going to rain today because it's about to rain here.
We'll see. I guess you'll probably send it our way.
So we are all here, and maybe just to talk about that to start with, we of course want to talk about today how we can foster, how we can actually make a contribution, something that like becomes natural to organizations and companies within our ecosystem, being Drupal or any other open source ecosystem, or So maybe to start with, I would like to ask just maybe every one of you, is your organization contributing today, and or how are you participating in open source contribution today? Maybe starting with you, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Drupal is the primary project that we contribute to, but as you know, Baddie, we also have we maintain quite a few repositories on GitHub around front-end code frameworks. So we do a lot with design systems. We have I would say a project called Particle that I believe your company uses that we've contributed as well. So I think for us, it's about, anything that we find useful, that we think others will find useful, we're willing to contribute it, whether it's inside of Drupal or it's in GitHub. As Angie mentioned, we also have maintained probably too many modules on Drupal.org. There's a lot of contributed code there that's been sort of stacked up over the years through the various versions of Drupal. And we're very proud of that. So that's why we want to talk about it today.
And maybe over to you, Deb.
Sure. So I work for Red Hat, and we have an important relationship with with open source. And most of the contributions we do are in the in the ecosystem, in the Linux ecosystem that support our commercialized products. But in the case of Drupal, we don't ship Drupal. We don't monetize or benefit financially from Drupal, but we use it for our operations. It's our corporate website. And because we have a very strong contribution culture, we have several dozen people at Red Hat that contribute to the Drupal project in different ways. I think if you go to the Drupal Association site, you can see some of the detail. But I was excited to find out that in the last couple of years, we actually now have a Drupal guild. And so it's a way of learning and sharing and giving back to a community that's important to us in a different way from an operational perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Denise, you've been part of the Drupal Association for many years.
Yeah, longer than we like to think.
But you've been doing more than just Drupal. You've been participating in many other open source projects.
I am busy that way, yeah. The company that I work for now in Ireland is called Nearform. And even before I got there, they were donating 40% of the core code for Node Core. Like they're a massive node shop at the we're writing the engine level. But they also wrote the COVID contact tracing app for Ireland last year, and we open sourced it at Linux Foundation Public Health Initiative. It was the launching piece of code for that thing, and it's actually the most used contact tracing app in the world, full-featured one, because of course Google and Apple have the bare bones one that they give away for free, but more people have picked up that code and used it or paid us to localize it for them than any other code base. So we're pretty proud of that.
And Catherine, Angie mentioned before how you were working together a couple of years ago with the Linux Journal, right? When she was on the cover.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
is that correct?
That was 10 years ago now. When Angie was on the cover. So we had a few Drupal covers. We had some that just had a big DrupalCon. We did an issue that was a really nice cover also that was about Drupal distributions. It was a bunch of ice cream cones with DrupalCon ice cream scoops, which was really cute. Yeah, so that was sort of the way that I used to contribute to the Drupal community, because our digital publication ran on Drupal, and I was responsible for that. But my way of sort of saying thank you to the community was to try to promote Drupal as much as I could, because we were standing on their shoulders. And but more recently, I have been working with Acquia. I had the opportunity to work near Angie, let's say, which was a bit of a bucket list item, on the Drupal acceleration team, which is their internal team that contributes to Drupal, which is really cool. And now I'm working on Acquia CMS, which is another Drupal distribution on Drupal 9. So now I've sort of pivoted into a more traditional role in terms of contribution. But yeah, some of the early contributions through the magazine are some of the things I'm most proud of.
Yeah, and you also have a podcast there's about open source, right?
I do, yeah. We talk a lot about open source. We talk about a lot of technology issues, in technology and society, internet, where the internet is going, very broad topics, actually, not necessarily specific to open source, but definitely relevant to open source. We have had a little bit of Drupal content on there. And I also occasionally, sorry, go ahead.
No, you have to do your advertisement. Like, where can we find your podcast and what's the name?
Oh, well, right. Yes, I should plug it, shouldn't I? Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. That is Reality 2.0, and you can find it at reality2cast.com. I also occasionally, it's with Doc Searles. He's my co-host, and he also hosts another specifically open source related podcast called Floss Weekly, and I occasionally appear with him on that.
Oh, nice. And today we are actually going to figure out and talk about how we can make, or, I think Dries, the reason why we did this, I wanted to do this panel, is that I think it was DrupalCon Europe, where Dries put it out there and said, like, how can we actually increase contribution to Drupal? And we've been thinking about this a lot as in our company too, like how can we balance the work from being a project work to then being a work that contributes to open source. And maybe just to start off, I would like to ask Denise, maybe you are here, with a lot of experience in the open source ecosystem. What is how does an open source ecosystem look like? And where do who would you say are the typical contributors to open source?
Sure. So the biggest misconception about open source by people who aren't practitioners is they tend to think that we're altruistic and very, utopian in our desire to work for free and better the world. And there is some of that in us. There are some of us that are like that. But the vast majority of open source is driven by enlightened self-interest. So that enlightenment is about the helping, but there is self-interest involved. And most engineers that are involved in open source are doing it because they get something out of it. And full stop, end of story. Either they get an online resume that makes it easier to get hired, or they get to work on some technology that they are going to use, and it's just easier to do it in the clear so that more people will adopt it, so that using it will be more, more broad. Or it's one that they depend on that needs some help, or that they need to influence in some way, or they're getting paid by somebody to do it because that company believes that it's a strategic advantage to have contributions, in a certain direction. So your first job is to figure out what will tie enlightened self-interest to the act of giving code to Drupal, and including the cost of doing that being less of a burden than the advantages that come with that.
And would you say that, you know the Drupal community pretty well now, and you also know other Drupal or other communities, and also asking Catherine Depp about other open source communities. Is there a secret sauce of finding that, or?
Yeah, well, the Drupal community is really unique, I have to say. I served on the board for 6 years. And I really enjoyed it. The original reason I said yes to Dries was because I wanted to understand why the gender balance was so good, and not just gender, but diversity in general. is exceptional in the Drupal community. If you're inside the Drupal community, it doesn't feel that exceptional because you want to do better, and there's lots of striving to do better. But looking from the outside, it's pretty amazing. It's better than most. And I was curious about why that was. And in 6 years of working with the Drupal community, I learned a ton about what motivates them and how they're different. The fact that most people are mom and pop shops, it's mostly lifestyle companies even now, even though there are a few really large companies that have grown up around Drupal. There's still lots of people who sub their work out to those large companies, or they work remotely for those companies because they can. And it's a workforce that's distributed all around the world. It's a niche in terms of there aren't that many people that are good enough at it to call themselves experts. And they have a lot more clout in terms of who they work for and how much they charge for their time and various other things. So it's a unique situation in that regard. There aren't too many other projects I can think of that are so full of lifestyle companies. And that offers some opportunities. Those those companies are vying for discoverability. They are living in a pond that is full of more and more people. And it's harder and harder for them to distinguish themselves in the minds of the buyer of services. And so ways to highlight what your company does and to kind of prove your excellence are really useful things. And this all went into the calculation we made when we were creating the credits system for people that are maintaining modules or companies that are maintaining modules. There was a lot more that went into that, and it's not perfect. It definitely needs some work, and we knew that shortly after it started. But it's a way for companies to be incented to be public about maintenance or responsibility they're taking for certain modules as a way to advertise the kind of work that their future employees could do with them, and also for their customers, the kind of expertise that they have. And I think that definitely stimulated some contribution back in the day. I'd love to see that refined so that it's more efficient.
Yeah. Anyone else that wants to tap into that topic, or?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think Denise touched on a lot of the major reasons, right? I gave a talk in 2016, I think it was, at DrupalCon New Orleans about this, and one of the things that interests me is, like, what does a company really get out of this? That, especially a larger company, why would they go? Because as Denise said, when you're talking about Drupal, you're talking about a lot of smaller companies, and it is sort of vying to be different, vying to have some control in the project, vying to really get leads and opportunities for new work. So there's a marketing purpose to contribution that kicks in, and it creates awareness of your brand and makes people want to work with you. But I think for larger companies, one of the really interesting things is how to attract and retain talent. One of the things that I looked at when I did this talk is, how does a big company, in particular, large enterprise, attract the right types of really highly qualified developers and talent? And I think, open source is a differentiator in the talent war for them, because it allows them to give people professional development opportunities to contribute back to open source. And it also, I think there's a really interesting aspect of sort of the open resume that comes with open source too, right? We do this at phase 2 a lot. If we can go to GitHub and see, code contributions from someone, it really makes the candidate stand out, because we can see that initiative. We can see how they think. We can see how they code. It's, coding samples are less relevant or less necessary if we can go to GitHub and see contribution there. So I think there's something really important about the talent aspect of open source, and why companies would want to incorporate open source contribution into their work for people, because it does add that additional interesting factor. I also like the idea that for big companies in particular, I think open sourcing things can create a force multiplier. It allows them to, without having to pay a large team, it allows them to get large amounts of development done, and to get those contributions back from those individuals. So I think there's many reasons there that are fascinating to me, and just things that we'll probably touch on again and again throughout this talk.
So I'm actually curious. Yeah, please, Catherine, go.
I was going to say, I think the talent thing is a huge, huge conversation. I think at a basic level, committing to open source contribution attracts the type of talent that a company should want. You attract people who have a natural intellectual curiosity. I think this is how you sort of bring together a team of people who thrive on issues like self-actualization. They want to be part of something greater. And I think it's hugely beneficial to any company of any size, but it's really difficult to measure.
Actually, Catherine, there was just a report released in Europe that made pretty compelling proof that, and not in the US, but in Europe, open source happens at the small company level mostly, because most of those big companies are headquartered in the US, so they get counted as US companies. And part of what's interesting about that is they were able to quantify per open source employee the benefits to that company. They get 4 to 5x return on that person's time, which is amazing. Of course, that's going to drive it. And that's a lot of what Europe is looking for. And that's why they're being so interested in starting OSPOs now, and, figuring out how to do open source at the government level, because they're seeing it as a force multiplier, to use Jeff's. Yeah.
So, and I'm actually curious about, so you talked now a lot about the talent aspect, about the individuals that are then actually contributing, and you want to hire them because you see that they are contributing. But I'm wondering, from the company perspective, do companies get hired because they are actually doing a contribution to open source? So can we put that over to the company as well? Do you have any experience of that, Deb, for example?
I don't think it's that companies get hired because of their contributions. That's part of it. They get hired because they may, for a company today, in today's world, with the amount of open source there is in our ecosystem, when you're building your own company technology roadmap, you want to work with other companies that understand how to work in those. You're going to be able to collaborate. That's where innovation is coming from today. All the interesting work is happening in open source projects, and you have access to talent that you wouldn't otherwise have. Diversity of opinions, diversity of people, diversity of ideas. So I think companies are highly attractive. Of course, I'm working at a company that works that way naturally and has for many, many years, but we're seeing huge upsurge in companies that are interested in changing the way they're doing business, changing the way they're doing development, changing the way they're doing partnerships. And we see that in part with the rise of the major software foundations like Eclipse Foundation and Linux and other organizations that support projects. Even the standards organizations like OASIS are supporting. So I would say the short answer is yes, companies are attracted to other companies that can do open source, but in profound ways that have really changed the way we create value for customers and the way we create opportunity for our own employees.
Anyone else that wants to
Yeah, I can say that when we got selected to write the COVID contact tracing app, the main reason was because we're known for rapid iteration. And they needed that because it was a moving target. The whole world was trying to figure out how to do it. We wrote that app from the ground up 3 separate times between the middle of March and the middle of July when it was actually released. And, we were able to do that because we're used to working this way. So.
And I remember also Mike Lamb from Pfizer talking also in some Trees note about Pfizer also looking at if the companies are contributing, because he actually says that the quality of the code is going to be potentially higher. Do you see this, Jeff? Is this being asked in public tenders or in any RFPs that your company
Not often enough. I mean, we definitely see it, and we certainly try to encourage that back in our response. So even if they haven't asked for that, we're pretty much going to tell you that we think it's important, and we're going to tell you that we're doing it. But I have seen it. I have actually seen. I feel like I keep talking about Git for some reason, but I have seen when they're looking for resumes for developers, they're looking for Git contributions. So they're actually asking for that, or for the company level, where's your Git account, right? What can we see that you've actually done? One thing that we did for many years that was very useful for us was we built distributions on Drupal, and part of that obviously was in an opportunity. In at least one case, we built Open Public, which was a government distribution, right? It was the first government distribution, and we did actually for a while start getting RFPs where they specifically mentioned Open Public in it, and we're looking at that and going, all right, we got this one, right? So I mean, I think there is a trend towards that, but like I said, it's not as much as I'd like to see. I haven't seen it in quite a while, and so it is a little concerning that that's not something they're asking more. So I'd like to see that improve.
Yeah. And I see that we have a lot of questions coming up in the Q&A, and I think we have around 20 minutes more, and I would actually like that we can also answer some of them. And there's also been an active chat, and I want to also remind you of the poll. We have around, I would say, 70 answers in the poll, and 75% that are watching, their companies are actually contributing to open source today. And I think that's 53 votes are for that, and 15% say that say no, and 8% say I don't know. So that's actually interesting to see from the people who are in the audience. Please, if you haven't answered that, go and press the button and let us know. We have also a lot of questions, and maybe I would actually like to go a little bit into the budget or calculation of, how do you calculate as a company, how do you make a decision of what to put into open source contribution, what to do work, when you want to work on your product or on your projects. Obviously, when you're a smaller company, it's more difficult because in the end of the day, you maybe have to pay out salaries to your employees. Larger companies like Catherine, you mentioned it before, in Acquia, there's even a team that is only doing a contribution to the project. So is there any right math there? Is there anything that we have seen where companies have proven to be able to grow but still make a relatively big part of their budget going into open source, being either letting people do contribution or financially supporting open source projects?
Well, I can't give you a percentage or formula, but I can give you some general starting points. We talk with our customers and partners in the field often about either contributing to a project or maybe even open sourcing something that they have. And the discussion always has to start with an honest look at what the motivation is for participating, because it's different. It may be because they want to influence a technology roadmap in a project. It may be because they want to earn a standing and good community rapport. And so whatever metrics you want to use to measure and figure out what percentage it should be, it has to start with your own internal business case on what you're participating. What is that enlightened self-interest? And then you'll have a more honest answer and a better conversation with the leaders in the company that may make the decision about whether they're going to commit or not. So that might be a good starting point. What's your why?
Yeah, I gave Dwayne OBrien, who's runs an OSPO for Indeed now, but he used to work with me at PayPal. I gave him a shorthand for how to decide if a project should be open sourced. And the first question was, aside from you and your mom, who cares? If you can find one other person who actually cares, and how do you do that? You go to a small meetup and you demo the thing and you explain that you're just an engineer and you're trying to get your company to open source this. Does anybody care? And if nobody walks over to you at the end, then you need to take that as a sign, right? Because there's a lot of wasted energy on projects that don't ever go anywhere. And so that's the first thing. And then given that you found somebody, do you still use it in your company? Because the tossing of code over the wall because the engineer who wrote it is heartbroken that it got canceled and wants to see it open sourced is, again, not a good reason for your company to put its brand on that project. That's a reason to give it to that engineer and let him do it if he wants to. But it's a lot of trouble to do proper open source. And you need to get what you need out of it, or you break the whole self-interest thing, and then the company will not follow through. And then the third one, assuming you say yes to those two, is since you can say that, do you have resources set up to continue to improve it yourself for your own use? And if you do, and that's great, because you're going to need those resources to build community, because you have to have conversations with your contributors and help them, right? This is the most important thing, and it's where most of the value of open source comes from. If you get through those three and you can say yes to them, then once the thing is actually standing as an open source project, can you stop coding on a separate branch of it inside your company, please? And work directly off of the public version as though it was somebody else's project. So contribute to it. If you have to take a snapshot of it and run it through your QA before you include it in product, go ahead and do that. But if you make any fixes, send it back to the public version. 4 simple things. If you can't say yes to those 4 things, you have no business doing it.
Yeah. So Baddie, from a agency perspective, I would say, it varies a lot depending on where you are. As everybody that works in that space knows, there are times when you're very busy, and there are times when you're less busy. And we've found that open source contribution is a great way to actually fill those gaps when you're not busy, to go back and make contributions, maybe from client projects that you'd been slammed on for a while, but when you get free, you come back through and you sort of harvest, is a term that I like to use, stuff that's useful, and make that contribution back. And it keeps particularly developers, but certainly other people can be a part of this too. It keeps them at sort of an even keel, right? We don't want to see people bored or overly slammed. So it kind of fills those little like mortar between the bricks, right? If the projects are the bricks, then open source contribution can be part of the mortar along with professional development. But it's interesting because we also have clients, like Red Hat, for instance. We built the Red Hat site and several sites for Red Hat over the years. And, when you have aligned cultural interest around open source contribution, you can actually do the contributions as you go as part of the project. And many of our clients actually support that. And, whether the time is billable or not, I don't want to get into that. I don't know if we build Red Hat for that time. I honestly don't know. But culturally, Red Hat is an organization who probably would be okay with that. So I think that it depends on who your clients are too, because a lot of the work you're doing, again, is for clients. And so, I know, in the government space in particular, there were organizations we worked with, the White House, for instance, that was very willing to allow that contribution and actually encouraged it as part of the open government movement, during Obama. And I think that's a wonderful way that everybody benefits. And that's reason why the contribution system that we have in Drupal.org that recognizes contributions for organizations allows for a contributing organization as well as a sponsoring organization. And I think when you find alignment there, it makes it a lot easier for agencies in particular to afford to make those contributions. Having said that, as I mentioned with marketing earlier, we have had times where we had a very clear calculation. And I know, Baddie, you put out a great blog post challenging people to sort of, what's your math, right? Like, how do you calculate the ROI on this. And I loved that post because it brought me back to times when we did very explicit Open Atrium, for instance. We spent probably over $1 million we calculated building Open Atrium. And what we did is we looked at how many projects we got from that and what the contribution or the contribution margin or the profit margin from those projects was. And we actually had, I don't remember, it's been many years now, but we actually had a number. We said we'll contribute up to this amount because we know how much we're making from it. So I think it's different depending on the situations, but those are a couple that we've run into.
And maybe just to recognize also all types of contribution. Maybe Catherine,
Yes.
Now we've just, often when you think about a contribution, you of course think about immediately just the code contribution, but you have to go to this Git thing and do something and apply a patch, and there's all these technical words, but that's only a very, it's just a subset of a contribution. What other contributions are possible in our open source world?
Oh, sure. I mean, code is the one that everybody thinks of first, but there's so much more. I mean, documentation is hugely important. It's hugely important to the project. It's hugely important for attracting new users. If there's not good documentation, people don't want to use your software. Community organizing, which is something probably a lot more about than I do. Event sponsorship, and then something that that I could talk about, media coverage. Media coverage is also a big thing. If you can get the word out to people outside of your community, instead of talking to Drupal people about Drupal all day long, talk to other people. That's hugely beneficial to the community and to the companies that are working in it.
So if you are today an organization and now you are listening to this panel and you're thinking hey, I think this is all really appealing and it sounds like it makes sense to contribute to open source, and we're not doing that yet. What is the action point? Let's say I have an organization that has now $10,000 and and can of course pay that to somebody to do work or can sponsor something. What is the action point? Being in any community that we are in at the moment in our heads.
There have been a lot of choices made on this, and some of those experiments are ongoing. So there are companies that use an employee poll to figure out how to spend money as money, right? Let the engineers tell you what you're dependent on, and the ones that make the best case, the money goes to that project. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is, I teach something called inner source, which is open source used inside a company as a way to clean up your internal engineering issues. Not everybody in the wide world of open source understands that my main motive in teaching that is to try to create more people who know how to do this kind of collaborative development, because we're still scarce. When I was on the board of Drupal, it was unbelievably difficult to find a qualified Drupal developer that could actually write your project first time and get it right, because there were people that could do that, but they were all fully booked all the time and everybody else was in learning mode. So, it's a scarcity problem, and it does eventually impact the project. So the more people who become trained in how to do this work, the better for the project and the better for open source generally. And one of the big problems in the sustainability of open source is maintainer fatigue. We hear about it over and over again. There have been academic studies about it. Looking at that and living with developers as long as I have, what I see is the kinds of developers that fall in love with open source and really devote their lives to it are rabbits. They're people who want to do the newest, coolest, shiniest, most excellent thing. And they're not constitutionally maintainers so much. And yet they're forced to maintain because we're a scarce resource. But there are only about 5 to 10% of the engineers in the world that get to work the way that we work, even now. And that means there's, 90 to 95% of engineers in the world who don't get to work this way. If we can convince companies to adopt open source methods in order to clean up their problems around bad engineering decisions that they've made, the way that they work, old school ways of working, like waterfall development models, that kind of thing. If we can get open source methods into companies, we automatically get a whole bunch of people who are lifted by the experience of working in a better way. And some percentage of those people are going to go looking for open source ways to expand that experience. And they're the maintainer types, a lot of them. So this is a long play, and I've been at it 6 years now. There's starting to be people in the open source world who initially thought I was crazy, who are now saying, oh, that's actually kind of clever. But it's only happening because now we have a snowball happening. We have most of the big banks in the world starting to use InnerSource to fix their messed up, old-fashioned, screwed up ways of engineering, right? Because they can't compete against the new banks. Stripe is eating their lunch, and they need to know why, right? So it's a long play, but I think it's a valid one. And if anybody wants to know about it, there's a nonprofit called InnerSourceCommons.org. You can go have a look, see what you think.
So thank you for that. I think I would actually like to, if any of the panelists here, is there any of the, because we could take a couple of those questions. I've been trying to, control the discussion a little bit in direction that hopefully answers some of these questions. But if there are any special questions in there that you would maybe like to, answer, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a provocative question which I like, which is contributing to open source projects a duty or a privilege?
It's both.
Both, yeah.
Both? Okay,
Both,
can you elaborate on that?
Well, the theory of the tragedy of the commons says that if we don't contribute commensurate to the value that we extract, we will end up killing the field.
Right.
So, we can handle a certain amount of freeloading, but at the end of the day, there is an economy of scale here, and we can't graze all the grass. We will burn out all the maintainers if we don't create contributions from people that aren't doing it now. So there's that.
I love that. I was going to say that my thought was, if you're using, then you should be giving back, right? So I think it's a two-way street, and that's an easy way to say it. So in other words, it's a duty for you if you're also benefiting from it. And of course, it's sort of a trick because most of us are benefiting from open source in some way, whether we realize it or not.
And there was a great blog post about that. The makers and takers discussion.
Makers and takers
put out also, I think, around 2 years ago. If you haven't seen that yet, it should be on Dree's blog post or blog site. I would actually like to, we have a couple of minutes left, and I think maybe one or two questions. But personally, I will jump over to the Drupal Association booth after this talk, and if any of you could also attend the Drupal Association booth in the exhibition hall, then please come there and we can maybe take some of these questions live and chat about it in the expo. So Drupal Association, I think 10 people can be at the same time in the booth. There is one more question that Irina, she asks about there are modules that are critical for site builders, but less important for large companies with more developers. So there's but these are still important and critical modules. What could actually drive support for, now we have talked a lot about the self-interest of doing it, but is there any way of helping those modules that are maybe not being sponsored by larger companies to get their things done quicker? Any ideas on how that could be done, or?
I would like to add that I'm not sure that. Well, I think we shouldn't be quick to assume what large companies are and aren't using or are and aren't interested in, because a lot of the same problems. I mean, part of the reason that we have these modules is because they're common problems, right? And so even a large company you think is, maintaining this one very large enterprise site, and you think that these are not tools that are applicable there. Most of the clients that we deal with, in my experience, they have often dozens of sites. And some that maybe are even behind a firewall. We've got intranets that are built out, on Drupal, for instance. So I wouldn't assume that something isn't valuable to a larger company just because they're a large company. But if you're positive that that's the case, then I would say, in all honesty, figure out who really is benefiting or using that module, and reach out to them and see if you can get other people to kind of work with you on it.
And one of the things is actually here at DrupalCon to actually promote your work and promote that to others. Is that what you want to say?
I was going to say another one of the things you can do is get it scheduled into the community hackathon, because that's one of the things that happens at the hackathons is sort of maintenance of communally held but nobody's taking responsibility kinds of things.
Right.
Exactly. So before we go, and maybe some of us then can go over to the Drupal Association booth. Maybe is there any last comment from any of you that you would like to tell here to organizations, companies that are contributing to open source or want to contribute to open source? Any last thoughts?
I just want to remind folks that if they want to get more participation in their project, make sure your project is open and welcoming. Drupal community's done an awesome job of making it easy to participate at any level, code and non-code contributions. And so if anything you can do to contribute to those kind of environments or create them goes a long way to having more people participate.
Baddie, I wanted to say that there was a question about, from someone in an organization talking about how they were hesitant. The organization itself was hesitant, and there's issues, concerns about privacy, security, trade secrets. I think that's a whole very interesting topic. I think to encourage us to maybe get back to that individual, because others, maybe have similar questions, and I know we've all dealt with that as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help with that too.
I think we should just continue this discussion maybe in the Drupal Association booth. And thank you so much for joining here today. And I think that we should just do this more often. I think this conversation is extremely important. I wish that
there should be drinks
many years ago.
Next time.
Yeah, and we should not be in different continents. We should be in the same place. Let's hope for that.
Yeah.
So thank you all, and thank you everyone that was also participating. Thank you for all the questions, and see you in the booth if you have time.
Yeah, and John, if you come over to the booth, we'll have some ideas for you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.